Good morning, Dan and Amy. We were talking about the return to school or not at the end of last hour, which dovetails perfectly into a discussion with our next guest. He's been on the show before. A financial services guy turned photojournalist, and a really good one. Chris Arnade is a writer and photographer, or photographer if you can't speak English. Writer and
Bit of the
photographer
Amy's there, huh?
covering addiction and poverty in America. He's the author of Dignity, Seeking Respect in Back Row America. This construct he has, talking about front row and back row America, he applies to a recent piece in American Compass at americancompass.org about kids in school, front row, back row, and middle row, what our American system of education is and what it should be, and that's the point of our discussion. Chris, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
So frame this for us. You begin with criticism of No Child Left Behind, in which I'm in complete agreement, and the federalization of education, or the federalization of just about anything. But give us the baseline here. Front row, middle row, back row kids in schools as a starting point for our conversation about what our education system is versus what it should be.
Yeah, I mean, I use the old school framework of the front row are the eager kids who really love taking tests, really love impressing the teacher, really want to get ahead, are doing the right thing as we culture tell them to do, which is to study really, 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 really hard, get as much education as possible, and then run off to college, and then run off to more college, and then run off to even more college. Get as many credentials as you can so you can move to New York City or San Francisco or certain neighborhoods in those only, mind you, or D.C., and compete for the very few jobs available. And then we have the rest of the classroom, which is kind of divided into those people who just don't really take to the system for a variety of reasons. One is, their home life is complicated. The other is just not their thing. They don't want to sit around, learning differential topology or set theory or reading Nathaniel Hawthorne. That's just not their thing. That's not who they are. And don't particularly enjoy taking standardized test after standardized test after standardized, continually being probed and measured, and and ultimately humiliated by the process because they might not be very good at those things for a variety of reasons.
So they have to wear a scarlet letter, if you will, since you mentioned Hawthorne.
Yeah, it reminds me of, one of my own children, a child who wasn't particularly that good at test taking, and, just wasn't their thing. They're an extremely wonderful child and very smart, but it just wasn't their thing. And, we continually make these people jump through hoops. And it's no surprise that, the number of hoops they have to jump through has gotten more standard and more set by policy outside of the neighborhood. It's humiliating to them. It's not surprising they drop out, or they mentally, physically, and just kind of, feel humiliated from the whole process. And it's really sad because, within that group of kids is a bunch of great people who have differently tested and differently educated wouldn't feel humiliated. Their skill set would be would be encouraged, would be applauded, would be given gold stars instead of being the ability to memorize a bunch of crap and regurgitate it on exams.
And the middle row kids that you express the most sympathy for.
Yeah, those are the ones that really, I spent 7 years driving all around America, and those are the ones that really hurt me the most. It's the kids who really want to do the right thing, and right now, they want to be the good student, and right now, that means following a set pattern that they're told from Obama down to everybody that, get as much education as you can. And so even if it's not their thing necessarily, or it's not their family's thing, or there's not a big tradition of it, and they do their best. They're smart, but they're competing against people who have a lot more resources, who have private tutors, and so they go off to college and leave behind their family and build up, some cases, $100K in debt. All for what reason? It's not clear. There's not the jobs there that we claim there are. You know, there's a sense that you can get any job you want with education, but certain education certainly, but you're not going to get any job if you if you study French literature and get a graduate degree in that. Unfortunately, I wish there were more jobs for that, but there's not currently.
So what do you
And
suggest
so,
we do for those kids?
We have to create jobs for experts in Flaubert, obviously, right?
No, I mean,
but
what guidance can we give them?
it's okay not to be interested in reading these certain, and do other things like apprenticeships. I went to a high school that was comprehensive in the real sense of the word. There was as much sense because it was the 70s and it was the South and it was a working class town, and there was auto mechanic. The courses I took from there that I learned the most from were auto mechanic courses, agriculture courses, drafting courses. Drafting is no longer a thing; it's been replaced by CAD, but CAD courses. Recognize that not everybody is meant college bound. Going to college disrupts people's families. It's pulling people away from their community and suggesting that they shouldn't go back to that community. And I think it's okay not to go to college. It's okay to pursue, or it's okay to go to smaller colleges like community colleges and smaller state schools and get a skill like nursing or get a skill like auto mechanics or get a skill. Those things are okay, and we should emphasize them as much as we emphasize going off to college and getting postgraduate degrees.
You write in your piece talking about the middle row. So they apply for loans, and 8 years later, that child is a young adult with $100K in debt, working a government bureaucracy 500 miles away, and missing the weekly family backyard barbecues. Even if it isn't that case, even if it isn't that Rockwellian for those kids, there's a lot contained in that one sentence that is problematic in terms of the promises that are being made or what is being extolled as the path to be taken in America and where that path leads you.
Yeah, I mean, there's our kind of intellectual elites who constructed a lot of this policy envision two scenarios for these. They envision that they become like them, working in New York City or working in D.C., either at New York Times or Columbia University, or they envision being a good little employee to go off to work at Google or Amazon, and as a lawyer or middle management. It's this very narrow framework of how life should exist, and it requires being basically economic migrants in our own country, the ability to tear up your roots and move to wherever you're supposed to move for the jobs, and giving up those things that kind of your community values, like the local community traditions and family, and it's very transactional, and our education policy experts wants the most educated workforce they can have so they can compete with China and India. Like, why are we putting up with that? Why are we all being required to compete all the time with other countries? Why not just give people a pathway to having a dignified life on their terms, and by their community terms?
Well, and also too, I mean, in the process, being nimble enough in terms of education that you're developing the talents that people actually have rather than the talents that you wish they had. I mean, you could work with me night and day in a gym, and I'm never going to be the starting two guard for the Chicago Bulls.
Oh, I'm
so
sorry.
my basketball talent has a cap, right? It's what Einstein said. The difference between genius and stupidity is that genius has its limits. Your talent in certain spaces has a cap, and so why not develop the talents that people actually have and then are also drawn to, are passionate about? I think that makes a lot of sense. The other thing you mentioned too, you say this a couple of times, humiliation and ridicule. And it's interesting you mentioned that too, because a lot of these people, the middle row kids, so they go on this track and they top out, going back to what I was saying before about, sometimes you top out before you thought you would. and they're ridiculed in pop culture too. I mean, think of Office Space or The Office. These are all about like middle managers or salespeople and in nondescript offices doing nondescript things or doing things that people think anybody could do, and they really are devalued and they're ridiculed. And it's because they didn't make it to be a C-suite type. And so it's not only do you have to follow this track, you have to follow this track to the C-suite, or you're a nobody, you're a nothing, you're just another guy with a vice president title in a bank or in an office setting in some cube city. So that ridicule really sticks with you for a long time, and I think it makes us more callous and less rich in a lot of ways as a nation.
Yeah, I mean, we have this kind of weird duality where we embrace the equality of outcomes. Like, we try to fight for the equality of outcomes without people just aren't equal. Like, as you said, you're not going to be the starting guard for you're not going to be anything for the Chicago.
Right. Yeah.
As bad as they are, you're not going to be anything on the Bears.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's right.
I'm going to be a place kicker for the Bears.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good luck with that.
But also at the same time, then we constantly probe and measure people and point out that they're not equal. So it's just this really bad system that just kind of, again, the core problem is federalization, where you just mandate from afar how people should be educated. And I'm really surprised that there's not more pushback from communities of every race and every place about why this is wrong. It's dehumanizing, and again, it's basically I call it intellectual colonialism. It's letting distant bureaucrats decide what is best for you and your children, and I really am surprised people have put up with it.
Well, there's something else too about education and its politicization, and you talk about it in the context of the front row kids right now, rightly frustrated by what they thought they were entitled to and what's actually available. They're now doing what they've been trained to do all their life, which is embracing politics and arguing loudly and forcefully to change the world, mostly on the margins, because that's all that's really needed for them. But that's not the case for others, and it's not just on a college campus anymore, as Andrew Sullivan argued. We all live on a college campus now all the time. It's also in the K through 12 level where you're not getting instruction in anything in particular except political activism.
Yeah, that's something I didn't touch on. A lot of the schools where that provide the most, bang for the buck, as you were, are not the ones that are the most celebrated. It's places like Colorado School of Mines. If you look at where people go to get a skill, and so when I'm asked on the road by people, when people find out I come from New York City and I have a lot of education, the people I'm hanging out with, like for instance in Gary, Indiana, or elsewhere, when they ask my advice, a middle row kid or a back row kid who's really very well intended, who wants to bet, what's my advice? I say, get the best education you can for the least amount of money, and then do it on your terms. Make it feel like you don't ever go into debt. Like, just don't do it. It's not worth it. Especially when you're competing in a culture against a group of people who have so much more resources than you. One of the things about this pandemic, if you look at it, is you realize that the wealthy who are constructing these policies from afar, they're okay. They're going to take care of their children, and they're going to make sure their kids navigate this pathway that they've constructed, because they're going to throw as much resources as possible at it. So I feel really bad for the young kids I met in Gary, Indiana, for instance, who were really good kids, and going to places like Ivy Tech, who I feel are just going to struggle in this system because it's going to really chew them up.
And I want to make one thing clear too, as you do in your piece. This is not to say, you are not saying, liberal arts education is worthless, or there isn't a place for people in the humanities and make the humanities a calling. There isn't a place for art and things of beauty. There isn't a place where people can appreciate Shakespeare. All that should be available, but you suggest educational freedom, not educational colonialism, which is what we have now. It's not instead of Shakespeare. It's in addition to.
That's right. I was very good at math. I just was. It's one of those things that, I just realized. And so I ended up getting a PhD in it because, It may sound crazy, but for me, it was the path of least resistance. It's where I was happiest. But I also know that a lot of other people that's just not their thing. Learning about differential topology like I did, it doesn't float their boat. And, so I'm not anti-intellectualism. I'm all for learning those things. But, making a bunch of kids, memorize a standard agenda set by far-off intellectuals is just, again, it's just mystifying to me, because it's about stomping out local values and removing them in place. It's just not the way you want to rule a country. It's very oppressive.
Really good piece from Chris Arnade at AmericanCompass.org. Do pick up his book, Dignity, Seeking Respect in Back Row America. Chris Arnade, photojournalist, recovering financial services professional. And Chris, always fun to chat with you. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Take care.
Take care.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You've made the switch, and it feels so good. You've switched to Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Issues of human suffering and societal injustice play incessantly on every outlet around us. Yet it seems like everywhere you turn, there are more unanswered questions and few honest explanations about why so many of our liberties are under attack. How do we regain order and a sense of normalcy? Find clear answers to the most important questions we face as a nation when you stream Morality in the 21st Century on Salem Now. This on-demand video discussion with syndicated media host Dennis Prager and distinguished theologian Dr. Wayne Grudem gives you a well-defined understanding about the enemies within our institutions and a vibrant roadmap to protect our God-given liberties. In Morality in the 21st Century, Dennis Prager and Wayne